This is Shabbos Lamed Hey. We were talking about insulating. Some objects you can insulate with, some objects you cannot insulate with. Those that produce heat, no. Those that don't produce heat, yes. However, that was before Shabbos. Now we're going to talk about insulating on Shabbos, whether that is allowed or not. So v'tamad hanyan, we learned in the Mishnah. Safek hashecha, safek shloi hashecha. If it's safek whether or not it's Shabbos, mifnei shloi hashecha, since it's not actually Shabbos, ha'im hashecha, therefore you let it insulate. Hashecha, when it got dark, asulun ton behen. Then it's usher to insulate. In other words, once it's completely Shabbos, you cannot insulate even with things that not produce heat. Question is, why? Talmud amrinam. So the Rabbanan say like this: Bifnei bittul beis hamedrash. There used to be lectures Friday night in the beis hamedrash. People would come to learn halacha for the week. They would be so busy with insulation, they would miss those lectures. Do not insulate. That solved the problem. Amar Abba says, no, it's mechshad because of a suspicion. Why? Shim Aimer at loishu mutter. If you're going to say the insulating on Shabbos is mutter, a person's going to make sure, he's not going to make sure to cook his food to its desired temperature while it is still day. And because we said that now it is usher to do insulation, you're going to make sure that his food is cooked to desired temperature while it's still day. What is desired temperature? So let's take a steak, for example. Some people like a steak rare. Some people like a steak medium rare. And some people like a steak medium. And some people like it well done. So is a steak cooked when it's medium rare? Absolutely 100%. It is 100% cooked. However, it's not to desire because some person might make it medium. Some person might want to make it well. Therefore, it's not tzarchai. So it's fully cooked, but it's not tzarchai. And the problem is the person's going to be involved with this on Shabbos. He may come to stoke coals. So because of that, we said that it's usher to insulate on Shabbos because the person's not going to make it to his desired temperature while it is still day. He's going to leave it on or try to cook it and then hope that the insulation then will help cook the rest of it. That's not good because then he's cooking it more on Shabbos and he's a malacha to cook. There's ein bishul acha bishul only on foods that are fully cooked and then get ruined. Like for instance, a chicken finger. Once a chicken finger is cooked, it only gets dry and disgusting. There we go. So man nafka bein b'nei. What's the difference between the Rabbanon and Abba? So it makes a difference if you're insulating snow or ice. If you want to keep those things cold, obviously there's no isser to cook snow or ice because you can't cook it freezing. You're trying to make it cold, stay cold. So therefore, it's not an isser of cooking. So therefore, I'll die to the Rabbah mutter. Therefore, I'll be fine because he says you're afraid of cooking. There's no cooking here. The al daita Rabbanon, but Rabbanon the taman according to the reason usser, then it's usser. You're still going to miss a lecture. You're still involved in insulation. You're still wasting your time. Still going to miss a lecture. And then it turns out, because of these Isurim, what happened? We said that it's usher to insulate because of an unshoveled and unbanked kira. A person's going to leave it there on Shabbos because he's afraid. He's not going to be afraid to leave his food fully cooked before Shabbos. He's not going to worried about that. He's going to rely on the insulation. That's going to be a problem. And also kira it's also to put inside a kira, even if it is shoveled, even if it's banked. Inside, on top is allowed. We know on top is allowed. But inside, we're not allowed because of timna, because of insulation. Therefore, we see that both of them both asurim are because of each other. Also kira shavala memuat. They prohibited putting it into a kira that has a low degree of heat, kira shavala maruba, because of one that has a high degree of heat. People not going to be able to tell the difference. What's low, what's high, what's the threshold? No one knows. Therefore, usher. Usher tavshel shivashel kol tzarchai. It's usher to have fully cooked, but it's not again kol tzarchai to your desire. Mifnei tavshel shelo yivashel kol tzarchai. On account of food that was not fully cooked over there. Usher chamin. And it's prohibited to leave hot water mifnei tavshel to shivashel kol tzarchai because the same thing with food. Because you can say, oh, you could do water, so therefore you could do the food. And then chazru v'tiru chamin. Later on, they said water's fine, just leave it on the stove. But food that was not fully cooked, that is not permitted to leave on the stove. Tani, we taught in a braisa. We may not insulate with hot ash. Amr Rav Zera says, Hada Amra. This is in essence saying like this. That Afer, Shinstan, Mutter, Limtain Bai. That Aish that has cooled is permissible to insulate with. Once it's no longer hot, now it's cool, you can touch it. It's not going to burn you, you can insulate with it. Kahada. according to the following story. Baraise, the Rabbi Yanai Hava Koma Avua, the daughter of Yanai was waiting on her father. V'havas Mula Kuma of Tavshila and Rexen. And she wanted to serve him half food. She ended up serving him half food. Amrla. So he says to her, hey, Isivda, how did you work this out? That you were able to make this stay warm. So Amrla, she said to him, Kimara Bigifsa. I insulated with produce that certain wooden produce stems that have been dried out turned to coals, and we know that coals are not allowed. So Amarla, so he said to her, Allah Tzahei Avdaken, do not do so. You cannot do with coals. Coals one of the things that produce heat. Ella Kamara Guy Kufsa. So it sounds like Begifsa, but it's Guy Kufsa. Rather insulated in a box. Vieva Kufsa al Gifsa. So she must have misheard and thought that it was Gifsa. And he says, no, the guy kufsa inside a box you could do the Evna kufsa al gifsa, and you could put the box onto the coals. Why does he hold that? If you can't leave food on top of coals in a pot, how could you leave a box of insulated food on top of coals in a pot? So it must be he's holding like this, that it's not going to shovel. A, he could say maybe it was shoveled to bank, but he didn't mention it here. And B, he says, but the fact that he put it in insulation in itself is like it's shoveled and banked. That itself is going to make sure a person's not going to shovel and move away the ashes. That's, again, like a cover. So that works the same way. And a box in insulation works the same way as if you put ash on top. And we can also say that since he's putting it in insulation, he's not really trying to cook. He's trying to keep it warm. Therefore, it's no gezerah to keep your food cooked. Make sure it's cooked before it gets dark, because you only put food in a box with insulation once you know that it's fully cooked. So therefore, that gezerah is not the problem. So therefore, those two gezerahs is not a problem. So therefore, he said it's not a problem to put that on top of the coals. And he doesn't say on top of the 3 stacks of sticks that we talked about before. He says directly on the coals is fine. Tzarchin about that really should put it on the distance away. But again, since he's not cooking it, and since it must be fully cooked, and since it's a sign not to move the coals, maybe that's why he allowed it to go directly on. Okay. Rab Zera says, Bahadur Rabbi Chanina Palik. In the matter of Chanina Shabbiyani, we disagree that Durash Rab Acha B'Shem Rab Chanina, we expound on this, that Hegfes, Lumatan, B'Tevin, Mikan, Umikan. By placing the mark coals underneath, so the straw on either side, so it is usher. Umay Debai Rabbi Yana agrees. You're right, maybe Taka, it shouldn't be done like this. I know that he has a reason for the Gezeros don't apply, but we're still Machmir, and we still say it should not be done. Oven inquired, Bilalan Mahain. If one mixed together, what happens if you mix together the items that the Mishnah says retain heat, produce heat, give heat, with the items that do not produce heat? So, Nishmana min hada. Learn from this. The time in Bekisus, Pharaohs, Ubans that one may insulate with clothing, with produce, and with dove's feathers, like we talked in Mishnah. Rabbi Yosef ben Pazi b'shem Rabbi Yosef bar Chanina. What status does he things have? Hada, the Tamar b'shloi Rav Vuvisan. This is when the decomposed matter does not exceed the non-decomposed matter. Aval im rava rekvuvisan. But if the decomposed matter does exceed it, also l'tzoin ben. So therefore we learn out, if the ones that produce heat are less, okay. If the ones that produce heat are more, no good. Now with sand, we have a question with sand. Is sand something that produces heat or something that does not produce heat? Tama and Tanina, we learned in the Mishnah there that we may lie a corpse in sand to keep it fresh. So 1 second, sand now seems to keep things cold. So ahan chala. So the material of sand, whatever is hot, it heats, and whatever cools it cold. It makes cool. So really, I would think this: it doesn't whatever makes hot keeps it hot, and whatever is cold keeps it cold. Sand, it depends on what sand is. Sand keeps temperature. So if you have cold sand, it was a cold night. If you have sand that's going in a place that was in shade and it's cold, then you can put a body there because it will keep it cold. And if you have sand that baked in the sun all day and it's hot, then sand will keep your thing hot. So sand does whatever it is. If it's cold, it will keep things cold because it's cold. If it's hot, it will produce more heat and it'll keep the thing hot. And Teven Baal Pikadon Hu. And Teven is the depository. In other words, that the same as you give it, the same as returns to you. So if you insulate half food in dry straw, right, you could do it because the straw does not add any heat. It gives what you give. So if you give it, if it's hot, you will make the straw hot. And if it's cold, you make the straw cold. Straw is not going to do anything to you, to your stuff. Anything that we require distance from a neighbor because of fire damage and because we're fire hazard, that's also to insulate. Some of it says, from where the Mishnah learned this about the Shabbos, we insulate the particular material, right, Friday, and that's to do with the fire hazard. Hada Amra, so we learn from this, that if it does not produce any heat, in other words, the things the Mishnah says you are allowed to insulate with, so then you do not have to distance yourself from a kaisel. Hasiv Rab Chagai draw a contradiction. Vatani was told in Brisa. Vahamakshir bias lechavera loy yasenu oitzel shel tvua. If a person rents a house from his fellow, he may not convert it into a storage house for grain. So what's the reason? Isn't it because the chaff will turn into heat and then it could be fire damage? Amar says because of mice. So Amar Pinchas Brev Chanina if it's because of mice, so Nisnu Yafilu Eiser shall call Davar. Then say anything that could any produce, anything that could attract mice is a problem. Have you kasher Chagai? So Chagai asks, well, so there's two answers we could have. The question like this. The question is, we learned that anything that produces heat, the person should not put within the walls of a house of a person where he's renting from or near his neighbor's house because of possible fire damage. We say, 1 second, but you're not allowed to put grain inside a person's house. So the Gemara assumes it must be you can't do it because of fire damage. So the Gemara says, no, maybe it's because of mice. And the Gemara says, 1 second, but anything can produce mice. So real like this, it probably is because of fire. Answer number 1, it is because of fire damage. However, grain itself does not produce fire damage. However, grain is flammable. So even though it doesn't produce heat, if you put heat next to it, we just said, straw gives and takes. So therefore, since straw gives and takes, if you put heat next to straw, the straw will catch on fire, and the straw catching fire is very flammable. Then it could destroy the rental premises. That's why you can't produce it. And if we're talking about, the answer is because of mice, so then certain things attract mice more than other things. And certain things also get lost. You lose mice. When you have, let's say, loaves of things, then you clean up around it. When it's a pile of grain, you can't really clean up around it. And mice like to bury themselves in straw, and they're attracted to it. They eat it, and they also could burrow in it, and they reproduce in it. That could be a problem. So therefore, straw is not because of a problem of itself being flammable and producing heat. It's because it itself is flammable, and it could then, if the fire comes, it could just incinerate and ruin the rental premises. That's why you can't do it. So if the Mishnah says you let it insulate, you could, because straw does not add any heat to your food. If anything, straw is only going to get caught on fire if your food is that hot. Also, Rav Shammai had another contradiction. What about stones? Right? That also you can't put next to someone's wall. So miyata also time behem. So if we didn't say that, it's also to insulate with them. The Mishnah didn't mention them. So interesting. It's interesting. The contradictions are items that the Mishnah did not mention, or the Mishnah mentioned that you're allowed to insulate, and therefore we're trying to say that no, there could be nezikin. We haven't produced a contradiction though that says any of these items that produce heat you can't put next to your friend's wall. We agree with those. So the ones that the Mishnah says produce heat, we agree with. By nezikin also, do not put it near the wall. The ones that the Mishnah says do not produce heat, so that's also good. That's fine. They could put them near a wall, except for grain. Grain have another reason. And now we're talking one that they originally mentioned, which is racks. So racks, what's the story with? So he says, Lo yaslam marchizin. So it's not because they generate any heat. Ella shein isin chaluda, because they produce rust. Ve'ein malkin arisai shel kaisel, and they can damage the wall's foundation. So really, that's actually very good. Rocks, it's true. A pile of rock could fall and could damage the wall. It could scratch, it could bend, it could bump, it could make holes. So rocks itself is not something that should be near someone else's wall. And not because of heat. V'hatani, the Bryce learned, any time in the Bislam, we can't insulate with stones. So tiftar Bislam shel kesa. So now let's interpret it, it's with silver stones. With other words, blocks of or bricks of silver. So again, we're trying to say how stones are allowed to insulate with because they don't produce heat, but you shouldn't be near the friend's wall. So we're saying stones don't produce heat, so therefore what must produce heat? It must be silver. So is Tane. So the one of the taught Bryce is taught like this. So time in slime, we insulate with slime. Vim Tane, another Bryce taught, and time in. We can't insulate with slime. Amar Rav Chizr says, man, the Amar time in the one that says you could insulate with shells of shel. That is with gold and copper, they remain cold. Umad Amar any time in the words one that says you can insulate with slime shel kasef. From the kasef, they can retain heat. Lo yisav davar lachen. It's not. Now we said moist things, certain things when they're moist, it's usher to, and then when it's dry, then they're fine. So it doesn't limit it to when they're moist at that time. Affiliation shezchakulu. Even if the dry items become moist for another factor. In other words, they could become moist, or the acid factor makes them moist. Min ilan maichin, and the proof is from flacking. Flacking, we said with certain materials like cotton and flax. So maichin like kivation is out lahain. Now flacking are. So now our flacking is not like dry items that become moist. They are. They're like dry items that become moist, and the Mishnah says that they cannot be used. So since they're dry, but they become moist from outside use, that's why the Mishnah says that they can't be used, and that's why, even if it's dry now, but if it comes moist from the outside source, so then it cannot be used.